Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining the Lafayette Club today. I'm excited to introduce Clarissa Ward. Clarissa is currently a chief international correspondent at CNN. She has served as a journalist and war correspondent for the past 15 years, working for numerous media networks such as Fox, ABC, CBS, and now CNN. Throughout her career, she had covers events as diverse as wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Georgia, and Yemen, just to name a few. She speaks 7 languages: English, Arabic, Russian, Spanish, Mandarin, French, and Italian. Our speaker has also received numerous awards for her work, including a Peabody Award and numerous Emmy Awards. And her memoir, On All Fronts: The Education of a Journalist, was released in 2020 and gives us a compelling insight into both her career and life. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So I just want to say I don't usually enjoy reading memoirs, but I found yours to really be an exception. You capture humor well and take the reader on a nonstop, nail-biting adventure. I think I finished your book in about 2 days. But anyways, I'll get to.
Well, that's good. That's what we strive for. It's it's really supposed to be, even though it deals with some heavy content, it's supposed to be kind of a fun read too. Gripping is what I'm going for, or what I was shooting for.
Yeah, it definitely was. I feel like I was right there. I feel like I was a war correspondent. I was like, oh my God, like, is she gonna make it?
Spoiler alert, I made it. So.
Yeah. Okay, so my first question is, in the first chapter of your book, you write that your unconventional childhood prepared you to become a journalist because it taught you to be adaptable, self-reliant, and curious. How did these traits serve you in being a war correspondent?
So, one of the basic requirements for being a war correspondent is that you have to be able to travel all over the world. And a lot of people are like, oh yeah, I can do that. I love traveling. I went to, Mexico for spring break, or I went to Thailand on my gap year, or whatever it might be. But this is a slightly different kind of travel, even than like the roughest kind of backpacking, because like you really have to be willing to enter people's worlds and live their lives as they live them, eat their food, respect their customs. And often those are very different customs to ours. I've spent a lot of time in places where like men and women can't consort, where there has to be segregation. You have to sleep in different parts of the house. And so you do just have to be adaptable. Even stupid things like you're often going to sleep on the floor. You're going to eat with your hands. You're going to observe prayer times. You're going to be respectful of fasting if you're in a conservative Muslim culture. So you have to learn that you are not the boss. When you are traveling in these places, you are there as a guest and an observer, and you have to be willing to kind of bend your will and your sort of assumptions about the world to the sort of reality of what you're confronted with on the ground. And you have to be able to adapt to other cultures. You have to be able to leave some of your judgment at the door. It doesn't mean that you don't carry your own values, or you don't make judgments in the long run about what you've seen or experienced, but it means that when you're there in the moment, your job is to do the best work you possibly can do, to tell the most compelling story, to really bring the full force of the suffering or the horror or the violence or whatever aspect it may be that you're focusing on home to the viewer. And so in order to do that, you have to be able to navigate worlds that are completely alien to yours, that are completely different to anything you've experienced. Now, obviously my experience growing up, I was like living in the US, and then I came to the UK, and my parents sent me to a boarding school at a very young age, which I found kind of very, very challenging and painful. It doesn't seem like an obvious path for a war correspondent per se, but in some ways it was, because it taught me to be resilient. It taught me that I had to learn to be able to adapt to new cultures and people and places, and to be something of a chameleon, even to make sure that no matter where I was, I could fit in with people, I could connect with people, I could find common ground, but I also could be strong enough and independent enough that I was able to sort of navigate the loneliness that comes with that too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just going off of that, your ability to adapt, the general perception is that it's more difficult to be a female war journalist, but I found it interesting that in your book, you argued that actually being a woman was an asset for you. when you were covering the Middle East. Could you just expand on that for us?
Yeah, it's so funny because it's always the first question you get from people, right? Well, in your case, the second, so well done. But no, because they're really curious, like what's it like being a woman in these crazy places and in spaces that are traditionally very much male spaces. War is testosterone fueled, violence filled, alpha male territory. But it's not actually. When you really understand and see war, you realize that 50% of the people suffering through it are women and children, right? And in a lot of the places that I go to, particularly in conservative societies, my male colleagues don't have access to those women. How on earth can you begin to bring home to viewers the full force of a crisis or suffering without having access to 50% of the population? I mean, it almost sounds ludicrous to say it out loud. And yet for years, we've taken it for granted that, like, of course, men are the ones who go and do that kind of work. So I think part of it is the fact that I have access to this whole part of the population. Secondly, as a woman, it's much easier for me to go undercover. And again, I keep coming back to conservative Muslim societies because that's where a lot of my experience in conflict has been. If I cover my hair, I can even cover my face with a niqab, I am no longer really recognizable as a Western female. And frankly, no one's really staring at me even because I'm covered in such a way that it would be considered impolite to stare. So I'm afforded the privilege of being able to be a little bit under the radar, which is, again, much harder for my male colleagues. I also have the advantage that in many of these societies, women in general are just seen as being less threatening, right? If you go, like when I embedded with the Taliban, for example, it was made clear to me by the Afghan filmmaker who we were working with. He was like, you cannot bring a Western male with you, because the assumption is that every Western male is either a spy or a mercenary or a military, part of the military. So whereas women, I think we're viewed more as like it's a curiosity. It's bizarre that this woman's husband allows her to go gallivanting around the world doing these kinds of things and going to dangerous places. But I'm not usually viewed with the immediate suspicion of like, oh, you work for the CIA, or, oh, you're actually a mercenary or a soldier. And so again, that just makes it a little easier for me. If I'm in the back of a car and we're trying to get through a checkpoint and I just kind of pretend to be sleeping, it's probably going to arouse less suspicion or create less tension, my presence, than the presence of my male colleague would. So for all of those reasons, I view it as having been a really integral part to me being able to do my job. There are absolutely risks that we face that maybe our male colleagues do not face in the same way. And I'm talking primarily about the risk of some kind of sexual assault. And I know women who do this job who have been sexually assaulted during the course of their work. That's a danger, that's a risk. You can take steps to mitigate it. But ultimately, when you're stepping into this work, there are so many different dangers and risks that you're taking on that I don't think that one becomes any more pronounced than the others. And so the issue of gender for me is not as much of an issue as maybe it would have been for my female colleagues who came before me 20, 30 years ago. And if you look at some of the more recent wars, the civil war in Syria, for example, some of the women who really were kicking ass and doing some of the best reporting in Syria, or some of the reporters who were doing the best work in Syria, were women. In fact, like a significant amount of them.
Yeah, you talked about your journalist that you really admired, Mary Colvin, how she passed away, and that must have been difficult. Okay, so what I also found it really interesting that you talked about going into kitchens and talking to women, and that they were less likely to lie and more likely to feed you. So I enjoyed that. Right. So our third question: out of all the dangerous places you have worked in, it seems like you were the most captivated by Syria. Why do you think that is?
I mean, there's a number of reasons. The first reason is that normally when I had covered war in Iraq and Afghanistan, in Georgia and other places, you really had this kind of slight separation, right? I'd go in Iraq, for example, and I'd stay in the bureau, which was like with my US colleagues, and maybe there would be another US network in the same compound. And you had obviously interaction with Iraqis, but you weren't sort of living and among them in quite the same way. Similarly, when I would go to Gaza and cover Gaza, I'd be staying in a hotel and there would be other Western journalists in the hotel. And so you have this space or this distance at the end of the day where you have a place that you can come back to and have a slight degree of detachment. And that allows you to get your work done. And it just also gives you emotionally a bit of space, which is really important. With Syria, there was no question of that, because the only way to go and cover the rebel side of the story was to live with these people. So I was living with a family while one of them was killed. I was living with them when the wife and children found out that he had been killed, when his body was brought into the sort of garage underneath the house, when they were mourning for him. And, you know, it's a very intense thing. You're like, I'm here in this extremely personal and intimate moment of grief. It's almost uncomfortable. And there's nowhere for me to go. There's nowhere for me to kind of step outside and take a breath and try to get a bit of distance from it. And what that meant was you became intimately involved with these people's lives, with their emotions. You saw in the most stark and intimate way how they were suffering, how they were being massacred. And it became impossible for me to walk away from that. I was so ensnared in these sort of deeply personal relationships that arose because of that. And it gave me a much different sort of understanding of the conflict. Also, a lot of the wars that I had covered were a little different in that, you know, in Syria, the dynamic was you had a state with a relatively sophisticated military and with major international backers in the form of Russia and Iran, who were basically fighting a rebellion that was made up initially of kind of idealists and activists, and then, you know, became a more sort of broad swath of society, but who eventually took up arms. But the people who were taking up arms were like greengrocers and carpenters and school teachers. They didn't have experience fighting. They didn't have two-way radios. They didn't have heavy weaponry. And so you had this real David and Goliath dynamic, with one side kind of there with their AK-47s and another side there shelling relentlessly into civilian neighborhoods. And so, yeah, there's a part of you that feels like, oh my God, this is like incredibly unjust, and this is horrific. And you feel a very strong sense of duty as a journalist that, like, I need to tell these stories. I need to make the world see what's happening. You always feel that with a story, but with Syria more than ever, and because so few people could get there, it became like a huge part of my life.
Yeah. And have you ever found it difficult to kind of separate journalism from activism during your career, especially?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think anyway, we're kind of in this age where like the lines are being blurred often between journalism and activism. And there's this sort of idea that it's less now about neutrality and more about truthfulness, which I think is fair, as long as everybody's committed to truthfulness in the sense that, like, facts, right? Like facts still matter. For me, I definitely crossed some lines because I could see the slaughter that was happening. And when you see, you know, babies being killed, you sort of feel like, you know, frankly, fuck neutrality, excuse my language, but like, this isn't anything to be neutral about. This is something that I have to make people aware about. This is something that the world needs to do something about. And I will say that ultimately it was very humbling for me, because in becoming so passionate about this cause and wanting so desperately for the international community to be able to do something to mitigate the suffering of the Syrian people, I would have my heart broken because I wasn't able to achieve that. I wasn't able to do that. But it was a very valuable heartbreak, because it was a humbling heartbreak. It was an experience that taught me that it's okay that I can't save the Syrian people, because that's not my job and it's not my responsibility. My job is to shine a light on the suffering and the horror and the trauma that they're enduring. My job is to keep telling that story. My job is to make people around the world feel connected to what's happening in Syria, to make them realize that it does matter, even though it's 1,000 different miles away and a different language and different religion or whatever it may be. My job is to form those connections. And so ever since I understood that, it has made my life easier. It has made my job easier. It's given me an added element of focus. And I will say that even when I sort of strayed in the, crossed the line a bit with activism, I never was one to prescribe policy. I never said, this is what should be done about the Syrian situation. I just was really pushing for a policy. And my biggest frustration, as you'll know about Syria from the book, was that the West didn't really have a policy. There wasn't really, like, the Russians and the Iranians knew exactly what they were doing. They had a policy, they were clear about it, they followed through on it, they were committed to it, they're still committed to it. The West, they say one thing, they do something else, they say something else, they do something completely different. And that for me was very frustrating. And ultimately, I think it was very harmful in the case of Syria.
Yeah, I saw in the book that you emailed one of the
Ben Rhodes, yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was funny. But going off that, could you also talk about, so you were one of the last Western journalists to be in rebel-held Syria, and that is when you did your coverage that ended up winning the Peabody Award. Could you just talk about that a little bit? So you snuck into Syria at that point to cover that?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't go illegally that time, but we were sort of squirreled in surreptitiously, and we were undercover. It was me and another woman. It was another reporter from CNN, Selma Abdelaziz, and we worked together for a couple of years. She's an amazing journalist. And we worked with actually an American journalist on the ground in Syria, who is himself an Islamist, and he's kind of a controversial character. His name is Bilal Abdul Karim. But, the reality is, if you want to go and spend time in a place that is essentially run by an Al-Qaeda franchise, you need to be able to work with the right people who can not just get you access there, but make sure that you're protected, right? Because it was incredibly dangerous at that time. I think now there are a few journalists who are able to go in, and it's a little bit less dangerous, because I think the Turks also have a bit more of a role in trying to stabilize that area, and certainly more of a presence. But for us, it was an extraordinary time, because you don't know what to expect. You've only got 5 days on the ground. It's exceptionally dangerous, as I said, and you're going out and shooting the first day. And we went to a town called Ariha, and we were just shooting some shots from like the top of the town, just like beauty shots, we call them in TV news. And literally, as we're doing this, fighter jets come over and start dropping bombs on the town. And they hit the fruit market. They also hit a park, but they hit this fruit market, and just blew everything up and killed women. We went to the hospital. I saw a 10-year-old boy with his head sort of hanging off, who was then later declared dead. And that's a lot to process in your first day. And keep in mind that, that morning I had been in Istanbul, or like the previous morning. I mean, that's a big transition to make in such a short period of time. And it's a lot of adrenaline, it's a lot of fear, it's a lot of trauma to take on. So it was an extraordinary trip. Sometimes you have those sorts of trips where like the stars align for you, in the sense that you're exposed to terrible things, but like that's kind of your job, right? Is to give people an accurate sense of the terrible things that are happening. And it's very rare that happens like that. It's like once every, maybe 5 or 10 years, you get a trip where everything that you want to see, you do get to see. But it's also a lot to process afterwards and to deal with in the moment. It was very, very frightening.
Yeah. Do you ever see yourself going back to Syria?
Of course, yes. I mean, I've been back to Syria a number of times in a different part of Syria, which is the northeast, like the Kurdish areas, where the Americans also have something of a presence. I mean, like, Syria is in my heart forever. That's never going to change. And I had been going to Syria a long time before the Syrian conflict started as well. And I dream about being able to go back to Damascus and going to the Umayyad Mosque, and going to the old Souk al-Hamadiyya, and going to Halab again, to Aleppo. I mean, this is very much something I want to do. I just don't know when I'll be able to do it, because as long as the regime of Bashar al-Assad is in power, it certainly wouldn't be safe for me to go back. I'm a known entity to them and not a favorite of theirs.
Like, look out for this blonde.
Yeah, exactly.
Is there an event or person that you've wanted to cover but haven't been able to, or just missed out on?
Well, recently, because, before Christmas, I did this big investigation with Bellingcat, this online investigative outlet, into who poisoned Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition leader, who ended up in a coma after he was poisoned with the nerve agent Novichok back in August. And the story was, it ended up being a huge story, because we basically found out that there was this FSB team. The FSB are Russian State Security Services, sort of the equivalent of, like, the FBI, for example. And although their structure is a little different, but that's another story. So there was this FSB team who had been monitoring and following him for years and years. They had gone on more than 30 trips with him around the country, never like at the exact same flight or staying in the same hotel, but monitoring and following. And most of them had some kind of expertise in either, some of them were doctors, some of them were chemists, some of them had studied in chemical defense at the Chemical Defense Academy. So, and then ultimately, one of them was also in the town, just a few blocks away from the hotel where he was actually poisoned. Subsequently, Navalny himself called one of the guys who was part of this team. I doorstepped one of them in his home in Moscow. Navalny then went, it sort of went viral, because it was, it was a sort of surreal moment, I guess. It's not often you get to doorstep a FSB would-be assassin. And Navalny called one of them and managed to dupe them into believing that he was with the National Security Council and carrying out a review. And basically, this guy admitted to, like, how the poisoning had been done in his underpants and all this. So it became a huge story. I came back to London. My visa, I had a double entry visa, and I still have it, was still valid. And Navalny announced that he was going to go back to Russia. And I knew he was going to get arrested right away. And I knew he was going to go to jail. And I desperately wanted to go with him. But COVID has dictated that Russia has said that no UK citizens can come to Russia at the moment. Not indirectly, not directly. Ergo, I was not able to go to Russia. And it's been very frustrating for me to watch his return and the protests that happened around that, and not be able to, cover that story, because I've spent a lot of time on it, and I feel passionately about it. So, but this is the world of COVID.
So Russia is kind of where your career started. You had a internship there before your first job at Fox, correct? Yeah.
Yeah, I had an internship at CNN in Moscow. And it was sort of like I had started learning Russian a bit in my senior year of college, and I was a bit like, why am I learning Russian when the Middle East is the place to be? But I think Arabic classes were all full or something, because 9/11 happened my senior year, so like everyone wanted to study Arabic. And so I didn't, and I had always felt this attraction to Russia, and this sort of, I had been going there since I was 16. I was super into Russian literature. I studied Russian literature in university, but I didn't really know how because that Russia wasn't a huge story in the early 2000s. And now it's interesting. It's like, whatever it is now, 20 years later, it is a huge story, and it is a big part of what I cover. And I'm very grateful that I took the time to live there. I've lived there twice now. And I love it. It's a great story. It's a great place. It's a complicated place, but the best places usually are.
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about learning languages, because throughout your book, you very beautifully detailed your relationship with your different language tutors, teachers, your Arabic teacher, your Russian teacher, your Mandarin teacher. Could you just speak about that a little bit? Because I really enjoyed those moments reading about it.
Yeah. So first of all, I just want to clarify, because like everyone's always like, you speak 7 languages. And I'm like, okay, I speak French and Italian well. Like I'm comfortable in French and Italian. I can understand Spanish very well, but my speaking is like not great because I speak Italian with a Spanish accent. I speak basic Mandarin, which means, I can get around and stuff. But I can't have like a serious conversation. And I speak conversational Russian and Arabic, which means, I can understand a fair amount of what's going on, and I can certainly navigate myself through most situations, but it's not like beautiful Russian or Arabic. So having said that, I love languages. And part of the reason I haven't really mastered one is that I just keep picking up new ones and trying to learn them, because for me, it's such a tool. It's a way of learning about a society. It's a way of connecting with people. It's a way of understanding a different side of a country. Yes, okay, you like read the news and interview the talking heads, but you see in the book, like the relationships that I've had with my teachers have given me an appreciation for like the soul of a place or of a people. And there's a humanizing element to it, which for me is so hugely important. Otherwise, as a journalist, it's very easy to kind of live in your expat bubble and only kind of superficially interact with actual, Lebanese or Syrians or Russians or whatever it might be. So for me, learning the language a bit and having, friendships with my language teachers has been a really instructive part in terms of understanding and connecting more with places.
Yeah, and you talked about how people just took you more seriously if you could walk up to them and.
Yeah, I think that first of all, like it depends. It can work in a number of ways. Like sometimes you can disarm someone. So like I've gone up to a Russian soldier in Georgia, like, in a tank and been like in Russian to him, like, what are you doing here? And there's like a, whoa, like what's, you kind of catch them off guard a bit. And like, it's sort of like amusing too, kind of. So you can use it in that way, but like also definitely like if there's a woman who's like scared to talk to you or whatever, like if you can like take her aside and like very like calmly and softly explain in Arabic or whatever, like who you are and why you want to talk to her and why she doesn't need to, like, yeah, that goes really far. It absolutely does. It shows people that you're not just parachuting in as some tourist, that like you actually have taken the time to try to learn. And even if you only know a few words, it means a lot. It counts for something. And then if you're in a place like China, and keep in mind, I lived in China in 2009, it was a really long time ago, but when I lived in China, it was literally like, if you didn't speak any Mandarin, you couldn't do anything. You couldn't get in a taxi. You couldn't order something in a restaurant. Like no one spoke English. I mean, no one. So then it's just becomes like a practicality thing. Like, okay, I really need to learn some Mandarin because nobody, otherwise I'll never leave my apartment.
And when you talked about going to China, you said that you kind of had a gap in understanding of like financial markets or like international political economy. So can you just speak about that a little bit? How you recognize that that was a gap in your knowledge and what
it's
what
still a gap in my knowledge. It's still a gap. I mean, my father works in finance and he was nagging me for forever to take an econ class and I never did. It just like my brain doesn't work that way for some reason. It's unfortunate, but whatever, I guess I have other attributes. But so when you go to China, especially, well, no, now as it was then, it's a largely in many ways an economic story, right? Especially if you're going in as an American correspondent, it's the story of these two superpowers and how they're competing and how they're also inextricably linked and bonded to each other economically. And you need to become kind of au fait with, ideas like trade deficits and intellectual property and, a whole slew of different terms and, currency manipulation and all this stuff that for me was a learning curve. I had to really take the time to learn about it, to understand it and process it better. But I do think that when you're looking like, my current role as chief international correspondent, if I hadn't had the experience covering not just war and conflict in like the Middle East and stuff, but also living in Russia, living in China, covering economic stories as well, like that's what balances you out. And that's what gives you a kind of broader understanding of the world. So I have found it hugely helpful. But I will also be the first person to admit that those kinds of stories are the hardest and most challenging for me. And I struggle to connect to those stories in the way that I do to others.
Okay, really interesting. Is there any area of kind of international politics that you would want to learn more about and also feel like you could expand your knowledge in?
Well, listen, like once you start doing this job, you realize that like none of us know anything about anything. Okay. Like I really know nothing about nothing, honestly. And being a generalist, that's kind of the deal, right? It's like, let's go out and scratch the surface, guys, and file a report and then go somewhere else. So there are so many things I want to know more about. And one of the most satisfying things at this stage in my career is that at CNN, I'm now afforded the sort of luxury of digging in on longer term, particularly investigative projects that take a long time. They often cost a lot of money, but they're much more enriching and informative and exciting to me because I really feel like I get to immerse myself in a world and learn something completely new. And it stretches me intellectually. So I'm grateful for that.
Okay. Do you think that in this day and age, especially with the preoccupation with coronavirus, people are perhaps becoming even more apathetic towards war-torn societies and news reporting in these areas?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think that it's less about apathy and it's more about like, look, we're in crisis here, right? Same thing, you know, with the US during the Trump administration. It was like America's in crisis. So America's focused on America. And right now, the whole world's in crisis because of COVID. So every country is kind of focused on its own crisis. And when you add to that the fact that we cannot really travel with the same ease that we used to, that means that definitely we are less focused on a lot of these conflicts. But I think what you come to see is that in some ways you can make the argument that a lot of these conflicts were maybe dominating the news too much as well, which doesn't mean we should just forget about them, not at all. But sometimes so much coverage can kind of feed in to the crisis as well. And so there are a lot of different issues going on in the world that don't get enough attention. It's not just about any one crisis or, human trafficking. It's like one of the most grotesque and huge problems facing bodies like the UN and other organizations that are trying to deal with that. But how much coverage does that get? It's almost none, because it's a very difficult story to tell. It's a very difficult story to get access to. So I tend to find that it can be a defeatist attitude to be like, oh, no one cares about this anymore because of COVID. Yes, people are in crisis. The focus is more introverted and more domestic focused, but I still think that we can keep telling those other stories that we're passionate about, whether they're conflict, whether they're something like human trafficking. We just have to find other ways to make them vivid and compelling to people at a time when they already have a lot on their plate and maybe don't have the bandwidth for a huge amount more.
Yeah. Is there any, I don't want to use the word obscure, but is there any issue going on now that isn't getting much media attention that you wish was?
Well, I mean, I would say, look, the uprising in Belarus over the summer would have, in another sort of post-Trump or pre-Trump era, got much more attention. You have a sort of revolution unfolding in, a country on Russia's doorstep with the oldest, longest serving dictator in Europe. And the police are brutally, and I mean brutally, crushing it. That's a huge story. That's an important story. And the sort of the culmination of the Trump presidency with the election coming up, and then on top of that, COVID just meant that yes, it got covered, but not it would have been wall-to-wall coverage in a different time.
It just wasn't given enough attention. Yes, that's so now I'm just going to transition into questions from the audience. So we have one from Kyle Page, kind of goes back to what's happening in Belarus now. I guess you can connect it. With press freedom increasingly losing ground to authoritarianism, journalists are being jailed across the globe at an alarmingly high rate. Are you concerned about the future of your profession?
Hi, Kyle. Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I think it's a very concerning time for journalists, because I mean, I think a lot of it, you can't lay it all at the feet of the Trump administration, but it certainly did not help matters to have the president of the United States calling journalists the enemy of the people, right? Because it feeds into a broader narrative that already exists out there, particularly in authoritarian countries. And it makes journalists exposed. It puts them at risk because it becomes like it's open season on journalists. It's okay to malign them. It's okay to call them liars. Well, that might be what happens in the US, but what happens in other countries, right? In other countries, the toll that that one pays for that could be much higher, could be much more dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think that it's a very, very difficult time for journalists. I also think that journalists have lost a lot of trust. We can't blame all of that on the circumstances or whatever political forces may be at hand. Part of it, we have to also try to do some soul searching and think of like how we can do better and how we need to do better. But the one thing that we need to be absolutely vehement about defending, which has sort of arisen more and more in the last few years and that I find incredibly dangerous, is this sort of growing post-truth era, and the idea that like truth doesn't really necessarily exist. It's like, oh, everyone has their different perspective, and so truth is kind of something of an illusion. No, like there are things such as facts and lives, and there is a difference between the two, and we absolutely need to be committed in saying that and singing that from the rooftops and making sure that our facts are facts and making sure that the lies are lies, but not trying to create some kind of moral equivalence between the two and saying, well, on the one hand, these people believe this and those people believe that. No, definitely the people who believe the lies. Okay, well, why do you believe it? And let's try to understand it and expand on it and not just judge them and malign them and just dehumanize them. But we have to stand up for the idea that like facts and truth are worth fighting for. They mean something, because the minute you end up in that sort of post-truth era, you are really ripe, as Hannah Arendt said, you are really ripe for falling vulnerable to the sort of clutches of a totalitarian state. And we've seen that over and over again in history. So this is something worth fighting for. It's a tough moment for journalists. It's an existential moment for journalists, but it's a really crucial moment as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then we have another question from Matthew Strubats. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Sorry if I'm not. What advice would you give to a student aspiring to become a foreign correspondent? Lots of famous war correspondents made an early career break by going into the field as freelancers despite the risk. What do you think about that?
Well, that's how I started. I went out as a freelancer. I left my job in New York. I moved to Beirut, and I just started going back and forth to Baghdad. I think that's a pretty good way of getting into the industry. It's very tough now because there isn't like a big war that's going on. So when I started out, the war in Iraq was raging. It was a disaster, and it was so dangerous. No one else wanted to go. So that created an opening for young, budding war correspondents, because we could go where other people didn't want to go anymore. But, I think that it's hard. I never set out to be a war correspondent. I became a war correspondent because 9/11 happened, and that was the story. And that was what I wanted to tell. And I like to think that I do a lot of different kinds of stories as well. They're not all war. If you're very specifically wedded to war, I think it's a tough moment for you. But if you're more generally just interested in doing like international, then I think there's a number of ways to do it, whether that be setting yourself up as a freelancer, starting out on the desk. That's the other thing I did. I worked on the desk, the overnight assignment desk, learning about how news organizations work, how they gather material. That's hugely, hugely valuable and important as well. but you don't want to stay too long. If you really want to be in the field, at a certain point, you just got to get out in the field because it's extremely competitive and no one's going to kind of hand it to you on a plate.
You have to go out and get it. And that's what you're talking about, that you were begging your supervisor for him to let you to go to,
Yeah, and it took a year and a half, maybe.
okay.
And then eventually he let me go. And then I had this sort of confidence to go and be a freelancer.
Okay. Right. Well, another question from Karthik K. When reporting, how do you convey the reality of events that seem so distant to most of us?
That's another good question. Well, you want to find things that connect us all. And this is like the most profound thing that I've learned over the years is that like we're all human and people are people. We are connected. We share a lot. So, what are basic human fundamental themes like the love of family, protecting your children, striving to have a better life for them, pride, dignity, what it means to have freedom or not, what it means to strive for something better. Like you find these themes that resonate with people all over the world, regardless of where they're from or what color they are or what religion they are. And then you work out how to tell a story around that. You find a strong character, you find a strong moment or circumstance that is a microcosm of the larger story, and you go from there. And in the back of your mind, I forget who used to tell me, you got to pretend like you're talking to like your grandmother's friend in like Minneapolis or wherever. I mean, Minneapolis is a random example, and you're sitting in a diner with her and just telling her, and she's never left the US, and you're explaining to her why this matters. Like, why do you care about this? Make it real to her and make it simple, not like simplistic, but clear, accessible. Don't start bombarding her with the sort of alienating, overly intellectual or geopolitical jargon that she can't really grasp or that doesn't resonate with her. Use simple, clear language and tell a good story.
Okay, that's really good. We have another question from Claudia. At the end of your book, you kind of talk about how becoming a parent changed you as a journalist, how it can change both mothers and fathers when they go into the field and they kind of have a different perspective. Can you just talk about that a little bit? How like your maybe approach shifted a little bit once you were pregnant?
Yeah, I mean it's a game changer. It's a real game changer. First of all, because you're just much more mindful of like how long I will be away from my children, how great the risk I am taking is. Like, I cannot put myself in a position of danger that is so elevated that I risk not being able to come home. I would argue that I always was making that calculation, but there's even more of a weight of responsibility when you have kids. But I also think for me, it's allowed me to connect much more with people in conflict zones. And I remember interviewing a woman in Yemen when I was pregnant, and her son was lying on the floor between us and he was dying of malnutrition. And I just like lightly put my hand on his hair. I don't know, I did it sort of subconsciously. And I just like burst into tears, which, obviously I didn't use that bit on camera. And it was kind of embarrassing because you're not really supposed to cry in the middle of an interview. But what I could feel this mother's pain, and I could feel in that moment fully the tragedy and the heartache and the senselessness that this beautiful little boy was dying. And it wasn't a statistic. It wasn't just like, here's how many kids have malnourishment in Yemen. It was real, and it was so haunting. And I hope that some of that emotion, honestly, and empathy and connection that I feel more attuned to as a mother, I hope that makes its way into my reporting.
And going off that, I don't know if this is too much of a personal question, but mental health of war correspondents or just correspondents in general, like Is that a topic that's not talked about enough? Like, did you find it really difficult to separate your life back home in the West to the persona
Yeah, I mean, look, it's obviously, it's like, you know, how do you adjust, like shuttling between, you know, one moment you're sitting in Aleppo in a pile of rubble with a family screaming over the death of their son, and then the next minute you're like in the south of France with your mates, like drinking rosé by the pool. Like, that doesn't make sense, right? That doesn't make sense. And not only that, you struggle with the sense of like feeling guilty, like survivor's guilt. Why do I get to leave? Why am I allowed to have fun? Why do I get to be in beautiful France with my friends and my family and happy and joking? And you have to learn, and it takes time and it takes energy and it takes therapy to learn how to be able to navigate shuttling between those two worlds. And you have to learn as well, fundamentally, the most important key I learned was that staying in Syria for even longer and depleting myself even more and giving more of myself would not make me better at my job. It would not make me better at sort of contributing to Syria in some way. Actually, taking a break, filling the tank, right? I'm speaking metaphorically, with the love of my friends, with some relaxation, with some fresh air, with some good food, with some good sleep, with some exercise. Like, that allows me to fill the tank. That gives me the energy to then go back with a full tank and really give myself to it. So you do learn to understand that like the privilege, and as much of a disorientating feeling as that is, and a confusing and perplexing and frankly disturbing one, the privileges that you have mean that you can do more and give more in some ways, and you have to accept them and be grateful for them and indulge in them and allow yourself to feel joy, because otherwise you're going to burn out. You won't be able to do this job in the long run. You just won't.
So this is another question that is very similar to what we just talked about. It's from Graham Moore. Do you ever feel hopeless when covering conflict, knowing that nothing will change or that nothing might not change?
Yeah. I mean, it's, you know, look, it's the sort of quandary of everyone who does this job. What's the point? People can still kill each other. Wars are still going to happen. And you know what? I think that there's an extent to which that's true, but then you also look at it like, look at how wars used to be. Like, millions of people used to die in wars, right? And people were getting massacred left and right, and it wouldn't even make the front page of the news because no one knew about it. The game has changed a lot. Social media, citizen journalists, have meant that like it's very difficult now to hide a massacre. It's very difficult to justify to a populace hundreds of thousands of people from your country dying. So I think already we see less war in terms of, like, if we're looking historically at the sort of comparisons, we don't see wars on that scale anymore very often. So I want to be optimistic. And obviously war is taking different shapes now. It's all about hybrid warfare. It's about cyber. It's about, you know, a number of different ways in which it's morphed. But no, I still think that being a witness, even if it's just one person, even if it's just one person's grief, that I was there, I saw it, I took it in, I heard it, I listened to them, I held their hand, I wrote it down, I filmed it, I told their story. There is something profoundly meaningful, I believe, in telling someone's story. And I think that sometimes that can even be some small comfort to people who are suffering. The idea that at least like the story was told, at least he won't be forgotten, at least they can't claim that he died of a heart attack, whatever it might be. So even if you, again, and then this is something I've learned over time, just stay on the micro. Don't get caught up in the macro, because you'll never be able to do a thing. You just be too fatalistic. And I think it was Ruth Bader Ginsburg as well, who was like, just like one step at a time, one good deed at a time, one small act at a time. That's actually how you bring about change. If you look all the way up the mountain, you're never going to climb it. But if you just keep on trucking, you know, maybe you will.
Another question from Kasha is, what prompted you to write your book in the middle of your very successful career? And what was the process behind writing it? Have you always, I mean, obviously as a journalist, you write a lot, but have you always liked writing longer stories, or was this kind of the first time you sat down and wrote a big piece?
So I have recurring nightmares, not about like seeing horrors in the rubble in Syria, but about being back in college and I have a 24-page paper due and I haven't started writing it. It's like literally it's my recurring stress dream. So I was asked to write a book back in 2012, actually by my editor on this book, Ginny Smith. And she was like, she heard me speak at our 10-year reunion. And she said, I think you should write a book. And literally even her saying that gave me palpitations. I was like, I cannot imagine anything I would rather do less. That sounds horrendous. I know I should want to do it, but I just cannot fathom actually doing it. And I felt that way for a long time. I would sometimes go back to it. Well, maybe I really should write a book. I should write. It was always this thing like I should do. It's something I should do. And I did spend a lot of time thinking about, why does this scare me so much? What is it that is so petrifying about writing a book? And then I got pregnant with my eldest son. And it just was like immediately clear. I was like, oh, of course I have to write a book, because otherwise how is he going to know who I am? Obviously, he's going to know me as mom, right? I'm mom. Great. Yeah. I'll make you a sandwich. Oh, yeah. Mom's a journalist. That's great. I've heard a few of her stories. That's very different than like having a book that I can give to my children that's like, this is who I really am. These are the values that I hold dearly. These are the journeys that I've been on, and like many of which, frankly, I hope you never have to go on, but I hope you can learn some of the lessons that I learned from them vicariously. And so then it became much easier. After I gave birth to him, I had 5 months of maternity leave, or I took 5 months of maternity leave. And I wrote the first draft in like 3 months. I started out, I would try to write 1,000 words a day or something. That didn't work. It was like too artificial and stressful. Then I just started being like, okay, let's just do 2 to 3 hours a day of writing. Doesn't matter how far you get. And so every day, I would be with my son in the morning. And then I would take 2 or 3 hours and just write. And then the whole rest of the day got to be with my son. So I was like, I'm not really, it's not like a horrendous time suck. And I was able to write the first draft really quickly. Now, the second draft, when I was back at work, it took me a year. That was much harder. But it basically flowed from a very authentic place within me. And I also think it's much easier to write about personal experience than it is to write a book about something that requires vast amounts of research, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really enjoyed the transitions. They really kept the reader interested. It was just very fast paced and really
Thanks.
Yeah. Well, that's all. Some questions. That's all the questions from us. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Thank you for taking your time to speak with us. We really appreciate it.
I've really enjoyed it, and you guys have asked really good questions, and I hope some of you are thinking about becoming journalists, and I hope I haven't put you off.
No, quite the opposite, maybe.
Great. Thank you so much,
Thank you
guys.
so much. Have a great day.
Okay, you too. Bye.